Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Associate Director of Library and Museum Programming at the American Philosophical Society. Greetings from the APS campus. Welcome to today's virtual discussion celebrating the recent publication of The Art of Revolution, a special issue of the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society. This volume is based on the proceedings of the Society's 2017 conference of the same name, which explored the role of imagery in influencing and giving meaning to the political revolutions that defined the late 18th and early 19th centuries. We're so glad that so many of you have been able to join us today. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who've offered their guidance, expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. For those of you joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who've made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The society promotes research by providing over $1.5 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Please check our website, amphilsoc.org. We'll put the link in the chat to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. We are using Zoom webinar today, so not to worry, you have all been muted. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button, which is at the bottom center of your navigation bar. You can type your question in there at any time. There will be plenty of time at the end of the presentation for questions with our speakers. We are also offering closed captioning for this presentation. If you'd like to use it during the presentation, please click on the CC box, again on that bottom navigation bar. It is to the right of the Q&A button. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speakers who participated in the 2017 conference and whose work is all featured in the volume. Our discussant for today's event is Cathy Kelly. Dr. Kelly is affiliated professor of history at William & Mary and editor of books at the Omohundro Institute. Her most recent book, Republic of Taste, Art, Politics, and Everyday Life in Early America, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press, has just been issued in paper. Congrats, Cathy. Joining her for the conversation are Laura Auricchio, DeAngelis Hopkins, and Ashli White. Dr. Laura Auricchio is Dean of Fordham College at Lincoln Center and Professor of Art History at Fordham University. Dr. Auricchio is a specialist in French and American history and visual culture in the Age of Revolution. Her publications include The Marquis, Lafayette Reconsidered, published by Alfred A. Knopf, which won the 2015 American Library in Paris Book Award. She is currently serving on the Scientific Advisory Board for France and the Americas, a collaborative digital resource produced by the Bibliothèque Nationale. Dr. DeAngelis Hopkins is a historian of early American material culture. She holds a PhD in American Studies from Harvard and has served as the research associate for the Harvard and Slavery Project. And Dr. Ashli White is Associate Professor of History at the University of Miami. She's the author of the award-winning book, Encountering Revolution, Haiti and the Making of the Earlier Republic, published by Johns Hopkins in 2010. Her current book project, Revolutionary Things, which is under contract with Yale University Press, examines the Atlantic circulation of objects associated with the American, French, and Haitian revolutions. My thanks to all of you for being here today, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kelly to moderate the conversation.
Thank you so much, Kyle, for the gracious introductions, and thank you very, very much for bringing us here and organizing us to talk about the volume. As I was saying to our panelists before we began, 2017 was a long time ago. It feels like a long time ago to me, and it was such a pleasure to be able to sit down with the actual published volume. Shameless plug, here is the volume. To sit down with this over the weekend and revisit these essays and to see how far they've come through the editorial process and to realize how really fine that work that was collected there is. I remember when we were going into the conference proper and I was reading all of the papers that were presented at the conference, and I was struck by the range of images and objects that people had drawn together to talk about the role of art in an age of revolutions. That variety, that range is very much present in the volume that I got to reread this weekend. It's also very much present in this panel that we're going to talk about today. And so I think maybe a really great place to begin would be to ask each of our contributing authors to reflect a little bit on the kinds of objects and images that they featured in their essays for the volume, and to tell us what it was about those things that they found so intriguing. And I want to proceed in chronological order through the Age of Revolution. So that means that we would begin with you, Caitlin.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited, as you said, to revisit some work from this conference, and I'm so glad to see the volume out now. I'm going to try to share my screen since we are talking about objects. I'd like you to be able to see some. So, all right. I hope that I'm successfully sharing my screen. All right. Well, I started this project. I was working on my dissertation about graveyards and gravestones in New England and sort of the political meanings of these places. They were really tied up in a lot of imperial politics in the 17th and 18th centuries. And as I was walking around graveyards with my camera, taking many, many thousands of pictures of gravestones, I started to see these gravestones from 1775 and 1776 that had these very overt political messages on them. And so this is just one of the examples. This one is in Billerica, Massachusetts, and it says, "Here lies the body of the widow Lydia Dyer of Boston, the place of her nativity, where she left a good estate and came into the country, May 22nd, 1775, to escape the abuse of the ministerial troops sent by George III to subject North America to slavery. She died July 28, 1776, aged 80 years. The sweet remembrance of the just shall flourish when they sleep in dust." So this was not a subtle political message, right? Whoever wrote this epitaph had, had a really clear understanding of what had happened and who they thought was to blame for it. And the reason that I thought that these gravestones were so interesting was they were these literate sources and these public monuments, right? A graveyard is a public place where people go and they can see these things. These things are durable. But they're also quite accessible to people. I mean, gravestones are not free. So this one is a really nice gravestone. It probably cost a good amount of money, but it was not inaccessible to middle-class white people in colonial Boston and surrounding area. So it's a really good way to get at these political ideas that are not in pamphlets, but they're sort of out in the world, living in these other types of media, right? So just as a quick refresher for what happened in 1775, there's the Battle of Lexington and Concord, right? Paul Revere, the British march out, the troops march out of Boston to Lexington and Concord. There are some small battles there, and then they retreat back to Boston, being fired at by the colonial militia that's gathering along the side of the road and following them back to Boston. And when they get to Boston, the troops sort of hole up in Boston and the American colonials surround them. But what happens to the civilians? So the civilians in Boston, about 10 to 12,000 of them leave Boston. And some of the loyalists who lived in the surrounding area go into Boston to be with the troops. And so what you have here is not only a lot of military movement, but a huge refugee crisis, right? The main population center of colonial Massachusetts has just like emptied out. And what happens is there are epidemics. There's a smallpox epidemic, there are dysentery epidemics, there's a lot of death and dying. And so in this sort of ring around Boston, you see these gravestones for people who died in those epidemics. And a lot of the ones that are really overtly political are for older women or very young children. And so in my paper, I sort of argue that this is making sort of a rhetorical move, highlighting the innocence of these civilians and saying that the troops are targeting civilians, making this really emotional plea to say that civilians are under attack, and really tying these civilian disease deaths to the war, to the military situation. And one of the stones that really does that really well is this stone in Groton, Massachusetts. It's a double stone for two brothers, one of whom was 5 years old and died in a dysentery epidemic. What you can't see in this photo is that in this graveyard in Groton, Massachusetts, there are dozens of stones for young children who died. Groton is a small village in central Mass. It in about a 6-week period in August through October 1775, they lost dozens of young children to this dysentery epidemic, and all of their gravestones. So if you were a person who went into that graveyard, you would see all of those gravestones and know why they were there. And his brother is not buried here, but is also commemorated on the same stone. His older brother, Nehemiah, who died in his country's service at Ticonderoga the next year. And so this is a monument that's bringing together both the death of this young child from disease that was part of this epidemic during the refugee crisis, and this military death as well, bringing those together, putting them in the same place. And it wasn't just young children, though, who were sort of defined as innocent. The last stone I want to show you is this one from Arlington, Massachusetts, for a man named Jason Russell. And his stone says that he was barbarously murdered in his own house by Gage's bloody troops on the 19th of April, 1775, age 59. His body is quietly resting in this grave with 11 of our friends who in like manner with many others were cruelly slain on that fatal day. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. Now, if you were reading this gravestone, you might be forgiven for thinking that Jason Russell was a civilian, was a person who his house was invaded by the troops. Actually, what happened is Jason Russell's house is next to the road that the British troops were retreating down on their way to Boston. And he and, the gravestone says like our friends, but our friends are militiamen. Like all the other 11 people buried here are militiamen from surrounding towns and colonies. And, they made a stand at Jason Russell's house. They were shooting from the windows. They turned it into a fort. And eventually the British soldiers stormed and killed them. So he was killed in his own home. But it's using this language, the barbarously murdered, is like using this language of, there's a long history in colonial North America of talking about Native people as being outside of civilization and barbarous. They're putting that on the British troops. Russell as a civilian, as an innocent. And so a lot of these monuments just use this rhetorical strategy to make the civilians seem very innocent and at the mercy of the British soldiers. So I found these really interesting sort of not pamphlets, right? Not printed political statements, but political statements that are really circulating in a community, that are really visible to a lot of people in that community, and are also for people who you don't see in pamphlets, for young children, for people who died of disease, and tying those things to the war is what made them interesting to me. And I will stop there.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So from that presentation, right on the eve of war, when fighting is beginning, the American Revolution is getting underway, civilians and non-combatants are having to deal with the wrenching disruption of violence. We're going to hop to the other side of the revolution, to the Grand Federal Procession in New York, and that means that we're going to be hearing from Laura.
Thank you so much, Cathy. And I too am going to attempt to share my screen. Let's see if this works. Yes, please let me know if it does. Yes, good. Well, I'm going to hope the answer is yes. Fantastic. All right, thank you so much. So what you're looking at here on the left-hand side is something that's called known as the Pewterer's Banner, and it's in the New York Historical Society. To answer your question, Cathy, about how I became interested in this object, to be honest, I'm an art historian and I'm a native New Yorker, so I spend a lot of time in my local museums. And And I've seen this banner many, many times. It's quite large. As you'll see, it's 92 by 120 inches. It's a very large banner, and it's something that you really can't miss. So I'd seen it many, many times, but I guess I had never really, stopped to notice it much. And then one day I was sitting there and I was looking at it and I thought, that's so interesting that it has this plate from Diderot's encyclopedia in the middle of it. Now, bear in mind that I am a historian primarily or originally of 18th century France. So my reference point for most things is actually 18th century France. So I looked at it and I recognized, I'm not sure if you can see my my arrow, but I recognized this immediately as coming from the encyclopedia. And then I went over and I read the caption. I realized it said nothing about the encyclopedia. So I said, well, gee, I wonder what else is not known about this remarkable object. And it really is remarkable. We don't have very many objects of this size and of this material that were made for public ephemeral processions in the 18th century. They just haven't lasted. They weren't meant to last. So I started to sort of delve a bit deeper into this object. One of the things that I started to do immediately was look into the event itself that it was created for. And on the right-hand side, I used to be at Parsons School of Design, and so I had the great pleasure of being able to work with a graphic designer who was able to create this map of Lower Manhattan for me. So I thought to myself, well, this is an object that was created for the 1788 Federal Procession in Lower Manhattan. So I asked someone to actually draw it out for me, to draw out that federal procession so that we could see where it went and what it did. Now, just for context, the federal procession, there were many federal processions in 1788, and they were all created around the time of the ratification of the Constitution. I'll come back to that in one moment. But it dawned on me as I looked at the route that this federal procession took, was that it was a route that actually went past a number of locations that were significant in the Revolutionary War. So that in a sense, I felt as though this procession was sort of deliberately presenting the Constitution as the next step, as the next sort of logical step after the Revolution. But then it did something else, which is that it went along the shoreline. And in fact, it incorporated into itself actual dialogues with ships in the harbor. This was very unusual for federal processions because most of the federal processions in other cities celebrating the Constitution actually were celebrating the protection that it would give to American trade. And a lot of it was actually, by American trades, I mean American manufacture, as opposed to global trade. What was really interesting to me about this procession was in the language and in the actual route of the procession, it actually incorporated global trade. It envisioned global trade as an essential part of the new constitutional land. Two other things about that. One is that, well, why would it be that the global trade would be celebrated here in New York, whereas in other places, it was really about celebrating, again, the protections, the tariffs, and so forth that would enable local manufacture to thrive. What I learned, delving deeper, was that in fact this procession might have been unusual among the constitutional processions in the country because it was actually not organized by the tradesmen. People have always assumed it was. It wasn't. They starred in it, but it was actually organized by a man named Richard Platt, who was a broker, a member of the Society of Cincinnati with an interest in global trade. And in fact, many of the people who participated in the parade were also merchants or brokers with international interests. So although this has always been cast as a sort of celebration of native local manufacture, it was not necessarily intended in that way. And then the very last thing I'll say that I learned about it was there was something that struck me, which was the date of this federal procession, because this federal procession was held on July 23rd, 1788. Now, in most of the cities that held federal processions, they were held after their states ratified the Constitution. But New York State did not ratify the Constitution till a few days later. In other words, this object, which has always been understood as a celebration of the Constitution, I firmly believe was actually meant as a persuasive event that was actually intended to convince the New York State Convention to ratify the Constitution. So to me, I've just touched on a wide range of things, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the tremendous number of avenues and the tremendous wealth of knowledge that's embedded in this single image. And so to me, this just speaks to the power of objects. So thank you for the opportunity to give that brief introduction.
Thank you, Laura. We know, even though we're coming up on July 4th, that the Age of Revolutions wasn't only about the Declaration of American Independence. The period that we call the Age of Revolutions witnessed revolution throughout the Atlantic Rim, and nowhere were the reverberations of that revolution as jarring, I think I could say, as they were from the Haitian Revolution. And Ashli White is going to be speaking a bit about that.
Thank you so much, Cathy, and thanks so much to the APS for hosting us today. And it's so exciting to be here from what is a very rainy and very swampy Miami. And I guess I got into this question of material culture coming out of the Haitian Revolution. It just began with a simple observation that in comparison to the US and the French revolutions, we have far fewer visual representations of the Haitian Revolution during the revolution itself. So if, and I'm sure many of you are well-versed in the imagery of the US or French revolutions, you can almost see the revolutions unfolding if you track the prints, right, over the course of their durays. But we don't have that for the Haitian Revolution. And there are a few reasons for that. There's always a question of attrition, what does and does not survive, especially from a revolutionary age, an age of war. But there are also more structural issues when it comes, in particular to the case of Saint-Domingue, in that the lopsided nature of the plantation system, its rigorous oppressiveness, and the fact that during the Haitian Revolution, Haitian revolutionaries, who were by and large people of African descent, were not controlling the production and distribution of visual representations of their own revolutions, right? Instead, it's mostly being controlled by white outsiders and artists in other sites of the Atlantic world who are grappling with the central ideological challenge that is the Haitian Revolution, a challenge to enslavement and a challenge to racism. And what struck me is this we all know for scholars of the Haitian Revolution, but over the past several decades, we've learned a lot about how even while, as Michel Roth-Troyot put it, white observers tried to silence the Haitian Revolution, to depoliticize it at its core, many people were talking and writing about the Haitian Revolution as it was unfolding, and yet they weren't visualizing it at the same pace or to the same degree. So to me, that raised the question of what was the particular challenge of visualizing the Haitian Revolution. And so I wanted to look a bit about what was produced or what was proposed for production. And so in the essay, I sort of dip into various media, into prints, into a proposed painting, and into one sculpture. And now, bucking the trend, I will share my screen to show you the print. Okay, so what I noticed is with these prints, so there's a real selectivity to what they choose to show about the Haitian Revolution. So if you're looking at the US or the French Revolution, you see lots of events being played out. But in the case of the Haitian Revolution, there's a kind of fixation on the bookends of the revolution. What we might see as the rebellion at Liqueur in the early 1791 and sort of dipping into 1793. And then the end of the revolution, when it becomes a war for independence, as Napoleon, via the Leclerc expedition, tries to reinstate slavery in Saint-Domingue, and Haitian revolutionaries come to the conclusion that the only way to secure their freedom and their citizenship is by declaring independence. And so as you can see in this print here from 1802, courtesy of the Library Company right down the way in Philadelphia, you can see that there's a way in which the Haitian Revolution is being flattened into a kind of a race war of Black men attacking white people who are depicted, especially as you can see in that vignette on the left, as victims. And this is repeated throughout the Haitian Revolution and its visualization, trying to cast it repeatedly in these terms, even while some of the writing and stories about it are presenting it still often on the hand of white writers in racist terms, but acknowledging more the political complexity, right? Another image I talk about in the essay is actually a painting that's proposed by Benjamin Rush for something he wanted to create for the new US Republic shortly after Laura's Constitution made it through, which was a peace office. And he writes about 6 big murals that he wants to be a part of this peace office, is to kind of remind people who come in how to preserve peace. And one of those is his kind of imagining of what could be happening in revolutionary Saint-Domingue / Haiti. And that is a life-size mural of a person, of a white Saint-Dominguean, a Black Saint-Dominguean, and a person of Jean de Couleur, a man of color, sometimes a free man of either African descent or of African and European descent, and that they're all working at the legislature at the same time, right? And so this I found pretty fascinating, in part because Rush, in his writings about US slavery and African Americans, has a really hard time dealing with people of mixed European and African ancestry. But in this case, he's sort of he's using, whereas the prints are flattening out the visualization, for Rush, the visualization affords him an opportunity of thinking about a kind of multiracial legislature and what that might look like, and placing it at the heart of this peace office, which is something in his scientific writings or medical writings he can't quite bring himself to do, right? And of course, the painting never comes to fruition. There is no peace office, but I found it interesting that this is a place he chooses to focus on as maybe a template of the piece. And the final object I look at was actually something that was made, and all the objects I've been studying for this book project, this is the one that I wish remained, that I wish I had, but I don't have. And it's a life-size wax sculpture of Toussaint Louverture that toured the United States between 1803 and 1804. And here in this print, you can see Toussaint Louverture right there at the center. And when I found this, my socks were really knocked off, and I live in Miami, so I don't really wear socks. So that gives you a sense of the degree of my excitement. But I found it fascinating that these wax displays, which were popular, this is the moment when Madame Tussaud gets her start in London. And they were popular in the US too. And this wax figure of Toussaint Louverture is shown in several US cities over the course of this year. And he's described as being a general, which everybody knew he was, as well as the governor of Saint-Domingue. And I find it particularly fascinating that they chose to show Louverture, in that if you look at the depictions of other Black people in these wax museums, they're often denigrating, similar with Indigenous people. But in this case with Toussaint Louverture, I have the suspicion that it wasn't, because of the way that they discuss him. And yet, this image of Toussaint Louverture only lasts for so long, and it stops in 1804, the very moment that Haitians win their independence from France. He's removed from the lineup, and instead he's replaced with a scene from Othello, right? Where essentially they morph Louverture into Othello to sort of talk about a tragic scene, namely his attempted murder of Desdemona. So I found it interesting that you have the visualization in some ways deals with flattening, and other moments it provides possible opportunities. And then sometimes when those opportunities are realized with the sculpture, it can only be held, at least for white audiences, for so long before it's shifted out into something else, which I think points to the multifaceted way that the Haitian Revolution was reverberating throughout the Atlantic world, not just in through written sources or through oral sources, but also the way that materiality comes into play for this revolution, despite the fact that we have so little that survives. So thanks so much. I'm looking forward to more of our conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It seems to me, listening to the three of you talk and having revisited your essays over the weekend, there are so many interesting points of connection between these essays, which seem on the surface, like they're all over the map, literally, thematically, geographically. The things that jump out at me are the ways in which visual and material culture are used to shape and to massage even the meaning of the revolution. All of those innocents that are buried in Caitlin's graveyard, some of whom are combatants, who are militiamen, who are being shaped as innocent victims of conflict. Laura's parade, that's ostensibly the product of the honest workaday artisans who are supporting American manufacture, but it's really about global commerce and the way that the Constitution might support that. Ashli's discussion just a moment ago about the ways that some observers of the Haitian Revolution wanted to flatten it out, which I think is a wonderfully apt term, into some sort of Black versus white race war. And then the other thing that seems to me to tie all of these papers together is the extraordinarily public spaces in which these messages are pushed forward, thinking especially about the wax figure of Toussaint, who becomes Othello that Ashli ended with. And I think that those points of intersection remind us that the meanings of revolution change, that they are malleable. And as we are coming right up on the 4th of July, when Americans celebrate American independence, I wondered if you could show our audience and the people who will watch this after it's recorded, one image that you think best conveys what you want them to think about in terms of art and the revolution. We would love to see it. And so we could just go with Laura and Caitlin and Ashli. I'm curious to see what you would share.
Sure, thank you. So let me share my screen again. So, when you asked the question earlier, when we had a meeting last week, and this question was first raised about sort of what most encapsulates, or what will I be thinking about this 4th of July? What do I hope people will be thinking about this 4th of July? And what actually came to my mind was Frederick Douglass's 1852 oration, which has come down to us as "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" And the reason that I say this is because, to me, the 4th of July, first of all, let me just say, is actually my favorite holiday, has always been. It's my favorite holiday because it's a holiday that celebrates an Enlightenment era document. It celebrates an ideal. And to me, the 4th of July is about living up, a call to live up to our ideals. And Frederick Douglass's oration, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" for me really embodies that essential contradiction that was at the heart of our founding and is still with us today, which is the question of, when we say that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that these are universal truths, really, to whom are they available? And what can we do to live up to that promise, to make the dream of independence, liberty, truly available to everybody? So that's the sort of challenge that I take up for myself on this 4th of July.
That's terrific. Caitlin?
Thanks. So I'm going to share my screen. What I wanted to share is something that I'm thinking about this 4th of July, and that I hope that others will think about too, which is when you asked us to pick an image, I, of course, had to choose something that was related to graves and public monuments. And so this is the tomb of the unknown soldier of the American Revolution in Philadelphia in Washington Square. And I chose for my image not just a photo of that monument, but also of the Facebook page from the Independence National Park, because that's where a lot of the discussion is going on. And I think that that is an important part of this. And so, as you can see in the picture, that this is a monument that has been annotated by someone, a member of the public, who has written "committed genocide" next to the statue of George Washington. Presumably, I mean, I have not interviewed this person, but presumably commenting on Washington and his participation in military campaigns against Native people in his military career. And so this is a monument that uses the imagery of the American Revolution, but the monument itself is from the 1950s. So this monument was put up in 1956 by a group of citizens and was only later incorporated into the national park system. And it's the tomb of the unknown soldier of the American Revolution. But Washington Square was a burial ground long before the American Revolution. There are thousands of people buried there. Some of them are Revolutionary War soldiers. Some of them are American. Some of them are British soldiers. And the person who's buried in this tomb was dug up by archaeologists and is of the right age to be an American Revolutionary War soldier. But no, you know, there's a skeleton in there, but it may or may not be a Revolutionary War soldier. But I just want people to think about the ways that bodies are used as cover to make a political statement unassailable, right? When people see that this monument has had graffiti on it, it's like defacing a grave, even though this is a monument that was put up with a political agenda in the 1950s. And so I would really encourage people to think about, you know, so much of our national conversation right now is about Confederate monuments and Civil War monuments. But if you dig into these things on social media and what people are talking about, that Revolutionary War stuff is very much implicated in this conversation. And I would encourage people to look into that. You know, you can go and read these comments, you know, little crying faces about someone annotating this monument. And I actually attended one of these Zoom talks with people from Independence National Park talking about this and talking about their policies about cleaning up annotations from monuments. You know, they do use the language of vandalism and defacement, and they do cooperate with law enforcement reporting these as crimes and, you know, possibly prosecuting people who have annotated monuments in these ways. And so I would just encourage you to think about who's using this public space. What does it mean to clean up committed genocide off of this 1956 monument that is now being protected as if it were a historic site? when in fact it's actually pretty recent and is more about the Cold War than about the revolution. And so that's what I'm thinking about this Independence Day, and thinking about all the stuff in the news right now about graves, especially coming out of Canada, with the graves of children who were killed in these genocidal residential schools. That's a story that maybe is not broken through as much in the US, but definitely the US has those types of schools as well. So just thinking about public space, who has access to public space, what it means to clean up these annotations, and what how people use the dead in some ways to make it difficult to question structures of power. And yeah, that's me.
Thanks. Ashli.
Sure. I went for a period object in a way to counter the print that I showed. In that, similar to Caitlin and Laura, I think what I find compelling about this is the way it reminds me of the various actors who participated in and were affected by the war for independence, and the mixed results of that war for so many people. So that for some, independence was gained, for others, independence was lost, and for still others, the full scope, as Laura put it, of what that Declaration of Independence was denied or piecemeal, to say the least. And so I think we are still very much trying to live up to the ideals and promises articulated in the Declaration of Independence. And this kind of intimate watercolor taken on the field at the Battle of Yorktown, there's something about even the very texture of the paper, which I think comes through really nicely, at least on my screen, sort of helps us sort of think about that moment, what was achieved, what was not, and maybe encourage us to continue to try to make good on the possibilities of that moment.
I would love to follow up on all of this, but the Q&A box is piling up, and I think I need to turn this over to Kyle.
Yes, indeed, it is piling up, and there's plenty of room for more questions. So please go ahead and ask them at any point. I want to let everyone know, as is APS custom, we'll also be sharing all these questions. So if we don't get to your question today in the event, we'll be sharing it with the speakers, and they can follow up. There's several questions here for individual presentations, and there's also sort of a broader one. Maybe we'll start with a broader one about the relationship between ephemerality and monumentality during periods of revolution, and how, I'll turn this over to our discussant and our speakers. How do you sort of wrestle with that? And in the process of maybe participating in this conference and listening to these papers, have your thoughts changed at all about that relationship between the two? Laura, you want to go first?
Yeah, I can actually chime in. It's a great question. It's one that I've really grappled with less in the US context and in the French Revolutionary context. Because during the French Revolution, so my first book was actually about a woman artist in the age of the French Revolution. And one of the things that I find most, I don't know how to put this exactly, but sort of the most striking conundrum to me of the French Revolution in terms of the visual culture is that there was, on the one hand, a desire for monumentality. There were a lot of commissions made for large-scale things, whether it be large-scale paintings or large-scale sculptures. But of course, and I guess Jacques-Louis David's Oath of the Tennis Court is probably the most famous one, but it exists only in drafts and in fragments. And to me, that is sort of the perfect encapsulation of revolution, that actually it can only be captured in drafts and in fragments. And in fact, sometimes through destruction. And that's just the one other thing that I would say, is that again, in the French Revolution, and particularly with the artist who I worked with, a number of her works were actually ordered destroyed by order of the revolutionary government. So that I would also say that on the flip side of monumentality is also eternal destruction, which is another form of monumentality in times of revolution. So it's a great question. I think really gets absolutely to the heart of visual culture in the age of revolution.
Thanks. Ashli or Caitlin, do you want to chime in? Any thoughts?
I can say something about ephemerality, and that actually I find that the most compelling part of the age of revolutions. And in some ways, the monumentality is something that is coming in part during, but mostly after the fact, with the attempt to build nations or new nations. But I think actually in the ephemerality of whether it be visual culture or material culture in the thick of revolutions, we have a sense of the ways that objects were not just memorializing or making concrete revolutions, but they were participating in actually how people were understanding revolutions at the time. The people turned to things, whether they were cockades, which are pretty famous, or quick sketches on battlefields, or whether they were maps, in order to try to understand what was going on in the world around them, and that the materiality of those things offered different avenues for exploring that versus print culture, textual culture, and even oral culture. And so I find actually, if we want to connect with sort of the full sensory experience and ideological experience of revolution, that there's something about material culture that is that allows us to tap into that because of its very ephemerality.
That's really wonderful. And I think that, Cathy, please.
You know, part of what I was thinking was I was listening to both Laura and also to Ashli, is that one of the things that I think that the papers that are collected in the volume, but also that I found in my own work, suggest with regard to that question is that that ephemerality is a moving target, right? The things that we categorize as being ephemeral, like the wax Toussaint, right? It's gone. We'd love to have it back, but it's gone. They weren't necessarily experienced as ephemeral at the time. Small things that don't survive, objects that are made on fabric, like the banners, the cockades, things like that. I think the phrase that I've used when I've written about it is that they survive in shadow form, in diaries and letters, and you can move past, in some ways, the sense of them being ephemeral, which isn't to say that they were monumental, simply by using other kinds of sources to understand how those objects or images registered in the eyes and the hearts and the minds of participants at the time. And I'll stop there.
Can I just add very briefly? I mean, so gravestones are obviously monuments, very literally, but usually when we think about monumental, we're thinking more of a larger scale of something public, or, but when I think about an ephemeral thing, there's ephemera, newspapers and banners and cockets, things that go away, but also people's experiences and feelings, especially people who are not doing a lot of writing or don't have a lot of access to printing. And so these gravestones are someone's attempt to capture a feeling and an experience that they thought was really important to monumentalize, not just to the community locally, but in a way that would last. And I think that that's really important when we're talking about, this mostly children and older people's graves, things that haven't really entered our sort of understanding of the revolution. And at this moment, I've been thinking a lot about epidemics and, what's the political valence of the deaths of people who are marginalized in some way, mostly, and how does that enter the national story, right? And how does an ephemeral experience, how do people's experiences, their grief or whatever they're feeling now, become monumental, because a lot of it is just lost. Yeah.
Great. I can't help but think, as I'm hearing all of you, the fantastic Paul Revere exhibit, which was put on by the American Antiquarian Society and the New York Historical Society, and I think now it might be at Crystal Gardens, which of course has this rebuilt obelisk, right? Something that was meant to be clearly monumental, but somebody forgot to take the lamps out, so it burned down overnight. But it's also, and this I think connects to a question for Caitlin, it's a work that's both iconographic and sort of, I guess if I would define it as sort of like visual representation, but also graphic in that it includes words. And somebody asked that a lot of the gravestones that you show focus sort of on revolutionary rhetoric. Do they ever incorporate sort of visual iconography of the war as well? And maybe it's sort of a larger question about what is the relationship between text and image in the works that you've been looking at?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can think of one or two gravestones from this period that have some unusual imagery. There's one in Cops Hill that has a cannon on it, but usually they're very standard. So these images are the things that you would find on any gravestone. Often they're actually pre-carved blanks, and then they just carve in the epitaph afterward. But that itself, I think, is significant, that they're expressing these political ideas in a visual culture that's very familiar to the people around them. You know, when you think of the Jason Russell gravestone, I mean, there is actually an obelisk, a later 19th century obelisk in that graveyard to these 12 men, but they're expressing it in this really local, familiar visual language, even though that gravestone is really a monument. It's a really early American Revolution monument to 12 people who were killed in that battle, but expressed in this way of like, this is our local culture. These are our people within this really familiar visual language. So even though many of the gravestones do not have a specifically like, you know, flags or something on them, they really are embedded in the visual culture of the community and using that to a political end, which is something that those communities had done many times before in many other political situations, but were using really strategically at the time.
Maybe this connects to a question for Laura about the availability of Diderot's encyclopedia and the sort of familiarity or lack of familiarity of that image. Do you have a sense of whether that was something specific to the maker, or if it's a sort of more broadly known image?
So funny you should ask. I have, well, let me just say, I am a dean these days, and so I'm spending a lot of time deaning. But in my spare time, what I'm trying to do is answer this question. So I guess I have 2 or 3 different comments to make. One is that there are actually a fair number of objects from the 1780s made in New York that actually suggest that there were at least some engravers in New York City who were aware of and familiar with and copying aspects of Diderot's encyclopedia. The second answer, so that suggests in the 1780s, it suggests that there were circulating. The second answer is that there were some lending libraries. For instance, the New York Society Library did have a copy of the encyclopedia. But the question that I really want to get at is, did the prints perhaps circulate separately from the full volumes? And might they have circulated even perhaps not even in their original forms? Might they have circulated through some secondary or even tertiary copies, reproductions, and so forth? So this is actually the question I'm trying to answer for myself, is how did knowledge essentially of the mechanical arts get transmitted from Europe to the young United States at the time? So this is indeed a question that I'm trying to answer. So thank you.
I think you've just kind of shared that we need to invite you back when you have found the answer. That sounds like a fantastic research question. So I know that there's one final question that Cathy has for everyone, but maybe before we get into that, just a final question for Ashli. A question here, do we have a sense, and I think you were alluding to this a little bit earlier, have a sense of how Haitians were choosing to commemorate the revolution? Is it possible they might have chosen oral creations instead of visual creations? Any sense of, the sort of internal memory, I guess, of this?
Sure. Yeah, no, there's obviously a rich oral tradition of the Haitian Revolution, that it's being charted as it's unfolding and in its aftermath. I would also, I'm actually focused on more on the moment of the revolution itself. And one of the things I found completely compelling is the way that Haitian revolutionaries are using material culture available to them, whether that be military clothing or cockades or maps or seized goods, as a way to press their ideological and political agenda on the island. And so I would say stay posted for more of that analysis. This paper sort of works on the outside of looking in. But of course, in post-revolutionary Haiti, and it's a sort of immediate independence moment, you've got Haiti divides into the north and into the south. And both of those leaders, whether it's Henry Christophe in the north or Pétion in the south, one of the things that they do is they build their capitals, and they build magnificent estates, they build schools, they launch essentially these big architectural campaigns, and they appropriate symbols, emblems for their rule, which are very much in conversation with larger Atlantic currents, as well as reflecting the unique and especially the African inheritance of the island. So yes, there is that dynamic, and I very much appreciate the question. Thank you.
Well, this is a fantastic program for all the cliffhangers that you're giving us. So there's lots to check back in with, but I do know, and I'll stop talking now, that Cathy had a final question to sort of pull all of this together today. So I'm going to turn it back over to her.
We've been talking implicitly, at least, about the afterlives of monuments, the afterlives of art, the afterlives of material culture. But it turns out that intellectual inquiry also has an afterlife. One of the questions that came up in our practice session had to do with, it was a question from Laura, actually, wondering how things had changed. How was your thinking about the particular problem that you were wrestling with changed since it was presented in 2017, which for many people means that it's worked out and written sometime around 2016. And so that's what I want to leave our questioners, our panelists with today. Since 2017, when you worked on this project and pulled it together, how has your view of your subjects, how has your thinking about them changed? Laura, you can start since this was your question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was something that struck me when I reread the volume, because as you say, it was 2017, that was 4 years ago. And in some ways it seems like much longer ago. And what really struck me when I reread my essay was that here I am writing about global trade in Lower Manhattan and writing about it in a fairly celebratory manner. When I think about it now, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, which really woke up a lot of white Americans, I would say, I realized that, you know what was another really large part of global trade in Lower Manhattan? The trade in enslaved human beings. And in fact, if I were to go back and work on that map again, I would place the slave market because we know where it was. And it was just down the block from Federal Hall where George Washington was inaugurated. And I would not be able to let that inherent contradiction go by today without comment. So that's what I wish I could go back in time and change. But thank you for the opportunity.
Caitlin.
Yeah, I mean, when I reread my essay after, not thinking about it for a while, the thing that really stood out to me was that I had not really paid enough attention to the language of the Jason Russell Stone around barbarously, and sort of that invocation of the specter of native violence from these white colonists, and I hadn't really dug into that in the essay, and I think that that's really something that I would have done. But I mean, in sort of another way, there's so much talk recently about monuments and public monuments. And I see so many moves to innocence, like so many people say, you know, well, you can't judge people on, you know, from another time, or pretending that monuments are not political, or in thinking about my essay and the gravestones, I mean, these little children's gravestones are still political monuments, right? Like they're put up for personal grief, yes, but also as political statements. And just the connection between taking up this public space and making a public statement, but then people don't want that to be criticized, really emphasized to me the ways that enlisting the dead in an argument is a way to make it hard to criticize power. And I think that that's a really important part of this and of a lot of military cemeteries, monuments, things like Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And so that has sort of changed since I wrote the essay.
Ashli.
Well, this essay is just sort of a slice of a longer, larger continuing project. And I guess since writing this brief essay, one of the things I've been working on is exactly the question that the very astute viewer asked about what it looks like from within Haiti and what kinds of things were available and what were people of African descent in Saint-Domingue and in other parts of the Caribbean and in the United States using to try to press their claims in the age of revolution, and also thinking about as part of that and sort of diversifying beyond, say, visual culture into more material culture, to think about how the materiality of things present certain opportunities, but also that they have their limits at the time in terms of their political mobilization, and sort of thinking about the capacity of different types of things and what they can and cannot do, and always sort of keeping in my mind what remains and what does not remain, sort of thinking about that that relationship for so many centuries afterwards. So thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming and joining us. I want to thank all of the participants. I know that we are running out of time. This has been fantastic, and I have taken pages of notes, and I'm going to be thinking about the kinds of things that you all talked about for a long time to come. As we close out, I just want to thank Kyle for inviting and organizing Adriana Link, who's been behind the scenes, but making all of the, herding all of the cats. And there was a lot of herding that went into this. And thank you all, the participants, for joining us, and wishing you all a safe and healthy and happy holiday weekend. Bye-bye.